My name is Michael Conti. I am a psychotherapist and a clinical supervisor, and together with Juan Serrera, who is another psychotherapist, we founded Conscious Growth, where we offer legal psychedelic retreats in the Netherlands. In this presentation, I would like to talk about the theme and explore the theme of when the erotic is present in accompaniment using psychedelics, namely MDMA. To start off this exploration, I invite you to have a moment of reflection and think about that question. What comes to your mind when you think about the theme of MDMA accompaniment and the erotic? And looking at what came up for you, did you in any way think about sexual boundary crossing? Was that a theme that came to mind? Before we continue with this exploration, I would like to mention a few points, one of them very much linked to the question I just asked you. The first being, we will focus on the erotic in its different facets, not only on situations when there is abuse. It's important to look at the erotic from a bit of a wider perspective here. Also, this presentation is not about having answers or a manual as to how to behave when the erotic is present in these situations. Instead, this is an invitation to reflect. It's a reflective space. And the final point is that although I will be talking perhaps a bit more about psychedelic-assisted therapy as a setting, it's also important to acknowledge that accompaniment can take various forms. There is more a shamanic approach, a more ceremonial approach. Sitting is also a way of accompanying people. So I will be, in my reflection, I am dealing with all of these, but there will be a bit more emphasis on the psychotherapeutic approach in this case. What do we need? What qualities do we need to explore this subject? The first quality that I think is very important to have is to be dedicated. Because the aim of the conversation is ultimately, how can I be of best service to the one I am accompanying? There is the dedication to the person who is going through the psychedelic experience. Another important quality is being brave. And by being brave, I mean that it's about engaging with what is risky. It's a risky topic, not avoiding it. It's about being brave enough to engage with your own shadow and not escaping from these themes. There is another important quality, which is being humble. And this humility that is necessary is because, as I already mentioned, the erotic is a multi-layered thing. So it's important to approach it from a standpoint of not knowing, rather than thinking that you know everything about it or even everything about yourself. It's also a topic that is very much related to power. So it's very important to look at how do we relate to power, including our not so good use of it. And also bearing in mind that when these themes are present, it is very easy to split and to project our shadow onto other people, and therefore avoiding being compassionate. This brings me to another important quality, which is that of being compassionate, and being compassionate towards those who overstep in the first place, because mistakes always happen, and splitting between us and them, the righteous and the guilty, is not a solution in this case. I also invite you to be compassionate towards yourself, because if you step into deep engagement with this subject, you will meet your shadow in the process. And I also invite you to have compassion towards me, because ultimately there is also a level of exposure on my side, and I am also not someone who knows everything on the subject, because I do try to approach it from a space of not knowing as well. And there's a final quality that is very helpful to have, which is that of being relational, and therefore looking at ourselves not as separate beings, but as being in constant relationship. I will start off by saying something about Eros, and although in therapeutic circles and sometimes even when psychedelics come into play, the erotic stepping in can be seen as a bit of a danger, no? It's a bit of a red light. Eros is not about danger. Eros is about love. And the Greeks used the different terms to describe love because love can't be boxed in one particular way. And also these different kinds of loves are non-hierarchical ultimately, although we have put a bit of a hierarchy in terms of the more bodily and the less bodily ones. But initially they're different ways of loving. No? But even Eros itself, Eros is also complex in its own way. No? So much so that if we look at Greek mythology, which is the one that I'm using in this case, it is not recounted in one particular story, but in a number of them. And I mention 4 of them here, the 4 major ones. The first one is the story of Cupid. No? Cupid is this lovely, mischievous boy angel figure, this god, no, who has these golden arrows to kindle love. And yet, many of us forget that he also had lead arrows to kindle indifference. And therefore, Eros as Cupid has this playful side, but also has a dangerous side that can cause chaos as a result of that indifference. We see this playing itself out in another story related to Eros, and this is his relationship to Apollo being the god of reason. So Apollo starts ridiculing Eros, and Eros, to get his revenge, shoots a golden arrow at Apollo the moment when he is looking at the beautiful nymph Daphne. And he also shoots a lead arrow at Daphne. And so Apollo is forever chasing her, and she is constantly indifferent towards him, and Apollo suffers this impossible love forever. Bringing to mind a bit the conversation between, or the reflection around how much do we go with reason and how does the erotic interact with that, and who wins perhaps. Another way of talking about Eros in Greek mythology is seeing him as a cosmic power. He is one of the first gods that comes out of chaos together with Earth and the underworld, the gods that come out of the underworld, of the cosmic egg. And in this case, he does not create chaos, but actually he brings order. He is the one who creates. A final interesting, very interesting actually, account of Eros consists of his relationship with Psyche. Psyche being, of course, we use in the word psychology, no? the psychological, the mind. But in Greek mythology, in Greek time, in older Greek times, Psyche means more the soul. And this is a great metaphor when we look at the erotic and therapeutic or psychedelic work, actually. Because the story goes that Aphrodite, who is the goddess of beauty and seduction, is actually jealous of the beauty of Psyche. And she wants her, as a punishment for her beauty, to fall in love with a monster, sending Eros to shoot an arrow, a golden arrow, at her. The problem is that when Eros meets the Psyche, and keep in mind what these 2 words represent, Eros falls in love with Psyche. But he takes her into a hidden place. And in this hidden place, he visits her only during the night in a way that she cannot look upon his face. However, Psyche, in her curiosity, and stirred by her sister as well, she once shines a light on his face, and the moment she sees it, Psyche falls in love with Eros. As a result of which, Eros feels that he has been betrayed and he abandons Psyche, and Psyche goes on this journey where she endures a lot of trials that are set by Aphrodite in order for her to reach Eros. And finally, Zeus, being the king of the gods, actually, as a result of all these, what she has endured in this journey, makes Psyche immortal. So it's a story of going into hiding, not fully seeing the other, the journey of the soul, of the self after meeting Eros, and also the transformation, therefore, of the soul in the process. That is Greek mythology, but actually Eros is always multifaceted, no? In a way that today, for example, we talk about sex, sexuality, sensuality, intimacy, and how different are these words from each other. What do they actually refer to? Even asking you to have a think about what does that phrase mean, to have sex? What constitutes sex? What does it mean to be intimate? Are we talking about penetrative sex, oral, kink play, sexting, genital touch, body touch, kissing, eye contact, talking, preparing breakfast? Which of these fall into this area of erotic and intimacy? Unfortunately, very often the way we approach the erotic is by splitting. We split the erotic from the rest of us, when actually it is a grey area. This splitting is a very old concept. It is a way of gaining power. No? It's like the maxim of divide and conquer, no? Divide and rule, that is used to govern, unfortunately, not to govern a number of countries, a number of groups of people. When we exert that same dynamic, we separate ourselves from the erotic, and therefore we try to do so to gain control over it. Or so we think. Because the reality is that the erotic is a stronger thing than our conscious mind. And we live in an era where we struggle to know how to be intimate. It's like we are very much in contact, but we are not so much in connection. So when the erotic steps into relationships, it brings with it an energy that we don't know how to deal with ultimately. Before continuing this conversation, this exploration, I would like you to keep in mind therefore these two important concepts that are very relevant. One is, we are relational beings. The erotic is a way of being in relationship. It is a way of loving, even when it comes to therapy and to psychedelic accompaniment. The second thing to bear in mind is that we are embodied beings. We try to distinguish a lot between what is genital, erotic, sexual, sensual, bodily, but the body is erotic, is desire and attraction. It doesn't mean that we constantly want to have penetrative sex, no, but the erotic is in the body, or is the body, as much as carbon is in our bodies and is in our bodies, and is therefore useless trying to separate it from ourselves, which will lead us to just have a lump of charcoal. Having spoken a bit about the erotic, what happens if in this pantheon of gods we introduce a different one, a new one, called MDMA? How does this new god relate to Eros, to Psyche, to Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty and seduction, to Dionysius, the god of pleasure? I'll talk a bit about MDMA in relation to the erotic here, and in relation to sex initially. The first thing to keep in mind is that MDMA's relationship to sex is that it's similar to having sex, in the sense that it mimics the physiology of the sexual response. In the sexual response there is excitement, the desire, the arousal, the plateau orgasm, and then the resolution of that. And this wave can be seen with different timing in relation to MDMA, where there is that openness that comes up with the arousal moment, and then going into the peak time, and from there, usually after the first couple of hours, slowly coming into a lower energy state. It is also linked to sex because it creates a similar state to post-orgasm. It also generates social bonding through the release of two important hormones, oxytocin and prolactin. And all of this facilitates the repetition of the behavior to strengthen the bond between the persons involved. All of these are important in sex. Another thing is that MDMA increases pro-social behavior. It increases the desire to socialize. It makes someone more open, more empathetic, more generous, more willing to cooperate. And these are emotions that are important as they are dimensions of being erotic beings, ultimately, and how we live out our erotic sides. A third important point to bear in mind is that MDMA affects the perception of emotional expression. It does it in two ways. It decreases the perception of negative emotional expression. This means that we notice sadness and fear less, for example. But it also increases the recognition of positive emotional expression, such that certain expressions are interpreted as showing, manifesting happiness. And this can lead to a bit of a misclassification of other emotions as being happy when they are not. And therefore, because of this decreasing the negative and increasing the positive, it will affect how much one will feel attracted towards someone else. MDMA also affects sexual behavior directly, in the sense that it increases desire for sexual activity. However, the reality is that sensuality and empathy tend to take precedence over sex when on MDMA. Also, it can impair sexual function, especially, for example, in men. 50% of men report that they lose an erection, can't have an erection actually, when they use MDMA, similar to how SSRIs work, ultimately. And therefore, MDMA is linked to sex and also to how we attach ourselves to the other person. Let's look a bit at accompanying now people in their psychedelic journey and using MDMA. And the focus here will be a bit more on the therapeutic side than on other ways of accompanying. When accompanying in these contexts, it's important to bear in mind that there's a triple power dynamic. The first dynamic involves the fact that it is a therapeutic or an accompaniment setting. And this means that someone is accompanying someone else. There is a responsibility of one person towards the other. Then there is a second dynamic, which is that of touch. Touch being something that is very often present in psychedelic spaces, psychedelic accompaniment, but there is something around who touches whom and with what purpose and which limitations. Another important thing to look at, another power dynamic that is present, is that one is using psychedelics. And this means that someone has impaired judgment in that moment. And these three dynamics, these three power dynamics, should all inform our reflections in relation to the subject of when the erotic is present. Let's look at a few themes that have come up in research in relation to psychedelic-assisted therapy and working with the erotic when one is under the influence of a psychedelic, ultimately. The first batch of themes relates to the therapists themselves. So one thing is about the requirement for authenticity, because clients are more sensitive to therapist material. You cannot hide it behind a facade in this case, because the person you are accompanying will notice very often. There's also something around role flexibility. It's a bit of a different way of being a therapist. It's a different way of being with someone, no? In this case, because you're there for a long period of time, you are more available to clients afterwards. You offer more varied services like taking them to the bathroom, which is not what we usually do now in therapy. And there's also another important topic, which is that of self-disclosure by the therapist, because this can in itself help increase trust and also reduce the power differential with the person who is being accompanied. If we look at themes related to the client themselves, the person who is undergoing the journey, there's the theme of vulnerability. They are in an altered state, and so it is really important to uphold boundaries more than usual. And when I say upholding boundaries, it's not about not doing things that I would usually do, but it's mainly about having the clarity in choosing what to do and why. And this links to the second theme that comes up, and that is deep regression, in the sense that some clients can enter into a highly regressed state, no more like childlike states. And in that, when clients or people who are being accompanied are in that state, they can push boundaries more than they would usually do. Another group of themes centers around body, touch being one of them, because withholding touch can be harmful, but at the same time, touch can also be a slippery slope, and we'll have a bit of time to talk a bit better about that. And also the body is present. During accompaniment, clients can end up getting naked, they can enter into very sexual spaces, and these in themselves are important because they can bring huge shifts in one's perception of oneself. But then the question arises as to how do we, as people who are accompanying, position ourselves and hold that space. The relationship between the client or the person being accompanied and the therapist or the person who accompanies is also an important theme. And an interesting one is this thing around reciprocity of love, no? Because the client can at times try to take care of the therapist, which we usually try to avoid. But in these kind of settings, this reciprocity actually means valuing the client's ability to love. So it can be very important to allow it to be present, but bearing in mind the power differential that exists. Another theme that I'll take a bit more time to talk about now is the issue of transference and countertransference. And for those of you who do not know, transference is when the client projects something that is theirs onto the therapist. For example, the therapist becomes a representation, unconsciously, of someone in the client's past. Becomes like the figure of a parent, for example. And so the client acts in relation to the therapist in the same way that they would act in relation to their parents, very often in an unconscious way. When psychoanalysis started with Freud, it looked at transference as something for the therapist to help the client interpret and therefore be able to move on from that. And countertransference, which is the reaction now of the therapist to the transference, what gets elicited in the therapist in relation to the transference, psychoanalysis saw that as problematic. But more recent perspectives, especially the relational perspective, sees transference and countertransference as a dynamic that is co-created between the two who are involved. There isn't a separation between two minds, but an interpersonal matrix. So it is not something to work through to be able to continue therapy. Instead, it is something that needs to be engaged with fully in order to resolve it. There is a particular kind of transference that is very relevant in what we're talking about, which is erotic transference. And this is when there is an erotic component to what the client experiences in relation to the therapist or the person who is accompanying them. For example, falling in love with the therapist. Or it can be an erotic countertransference where the therapist or the person who is accompanying falls in love or has erotic feelings or sexual feelings towards the client or the person who is going through their psychedelic journey. Some can see this as being problematic, but from a relational framework, we need to engage in this, and we need to engage in what is coming up in order to actually create the healing that we are trying to get to. But of course, engaging with it means engaging with it in the right way. And that is why we will talk now about ethics. But it's also important to acknowledge that ultimately, stepping into the erotic from this perspective when accompanying people means that it is very exposing for the therapist. But we need to really believe that engagement is the only way to ultimately help the people we are helping to move forward. Starting to think a bit about ethics now, I would like you to have a think about that question. What is my reaction when I hear about sexual ethical violations? When people cross boundaries? And I would like you to think about your answer from a non-judgmental way, because your reaction to that is ultimately what will color the way you look at this whole theme of the erotic being present in psychedelic-assisted spaces or psychedelic accompaniment. So I mentioned a few things about what I'm going to talk about now when we talk about ethics. The first is I'm going to work under the assumption that there are no intentional violations of boundaries. There are boundary violations, there are many of them, in psychedelic spaces, in therapy itself. Very often it is not intentional. Things happen. It doesn't mean that there isn't a responsibility, of course. The second thing is that the aim of what I'm going to talk about is not to assess ethical codes. MAPS, for example, has an ethical code that refers to the erotic when accompanying people with MDMA, but the MAPS protocol is intended for research in the Western world. And so one needs to bear in mind that there are different ways of working. And not everything is determined by our Euro-American-centric perspective. It's also important to bear in mind that there is a cultural aspect to how we look at ethics. We live in a Judeo-Christian post-Victorian era. There is a strong influence of American morality, which is not very body or sex positive for that matter. It's also a culture that is very much based on suing and litigation. And this definitely has an effect on how research is done, and how literature is written in the fields of therapy and in the field of psychedelics in general. So important to have that in mind when we're thinking about this subject. And the fourth thing I would like to mention is the foundation of an ethical framework is ultimately love. Of course, love is not just a word, but that is the framework within which we need to think of it, because ethics is about how do I behave in a responsible and loving way towards someone else. So having those things in place, I would like to mention an ethical framework that a number of people use, and this is very much the prescriptive punitive framework. In this case, the individual is responsible for their behavior. The focus is on creating a set of rules. We micromanage behavior. You can do this, but not that, but not exactly like this, but only in that way. If you break a rule, you will be blamed and you will be punished. So you will try to avoid being caught out in the first place. So the question here is ultimately, how can the perpetrator be punished? And this is an ethical system that is based on fear and punishment. There is, however, a different approach to ethics, and this is more of a relational and reparative framework, where we do not pathologize perspectives on the body and the erotic. We don't avoid risky subjects because actually nothing is safe. It's a bit like life, no? Life is a dangerous act that will entail in death, ultimately. But within this framework, within the relational framework, there still needs to be constant monitoring of what is happening but more from a perspective of being a loving supervisor in psychotherapeutic terms, or of a loving parent or a loving guardian. No? And this entails recognizing that there are power differentials. So one is in the therapist role, and another person is in the client role. One is in an altered state, and therefore has impaired function. What is the reason for being in the accompaniment role in the first place? Who knows what about whom? It's also about recognizing the shadow, recognizing that we all misuse power. We are all attracted to it. Everybody can cause harm. And this means not engaging in this dynamic of us against them. Otherwise, what we end up doing is we end up splitting reality, the good from the bad, light from shadow. And in doing so, what we end up doing actually is not getting rid of the shadow, but hiding it. And therefore, things will still happen, but outside of our awareness. This relational ethics perspective looks at collective responsibility. It looks at what is created, co-created, between the therapist and the client, the person who's accompanying and the person who is going on their journey. How does that sit within what is created within the therapeutic and psychedelic community? Everybody is responsible for their role, but what happens is a result of all of this, of all of them. And therefore, we look at systemic accountability, not individual accountability. We look at how we all contribute to everything that happens, including boundary crossings, boundary violations, through our perspectives, our judgments, our expectations, our lack of availability, for example, to people who are struggling. So the aim in this perspective, in the relational ethics approach, is that when someone commits an ethical mistake and needs help, the help is offered. It's not about blaming and punishing, but listening and helping, so as to avoid that bigger mistakes happen. In a way, it is similar to the brownie points that pilots use. So the question here is, how can the perpetrator be helped? And it is based on taking responsibility not for the behavior in itself, but mainly taking responsibility for the relationship, which of course includes a way of behaving, of course. So how do we act ethically in situations where the erotic is present in psychedelic accompaniment? I will start off with the Hippocratic Oath, the phrase saying, "I will willingly refrain from doing any injury or wrong from falsehood." And therefore the big maxim is, do no harm. And one way of ensuring that we do no harm is that when working with altered states, in a way, the more extraordinary the state, the more ordinary the ethics. And that is a quote from someone whose surname is Taylor, saying that the deeper the client moves into a state of consciousness, which has an inner or transpersonal focus, the greater the need for a professional's adherence to the ordinary ethical issues. So if we're accompanying someone and they're connecting very deeply with their sexuality, maybe going into transpersonal dimensions, it is not the time to engage in closer touch, for example. No? It's a time to give space to that person, just to make sure that the boundaries are not being tampered with at that moment. What can help us also is not only looking at our behaviors, but looking at our attitudes. Checking with myself, what is my motivation in accompanying people? Is it to serve them? Is it to serve them with love? No. What is my view of the client's erotic self? Is it a non-pathological one where I don't see any problem with a client experiences sexual feelings? The other attitude, which we have already spoken about initially now in relation to this presentation, is the attitude of humility, being humble. Being humble in terms of not knowing what the person is actually feeling. Even if they say that they have sexual desire, you don't actually know their experience, remembering that. But also remembering that perhaps you don't know also completely in a clear way what is happening inside you. What are the unconscious dynamics that might be being triggered in those moments? And being therefore humble also in relation to yourself. If we look at behaviors in particular, something that is very important is expanding our self-awareness, shedding more light, dealing with our shadows so that we can see more what is actually happening and not allow things to be acted out without our awareness. It helps to look at how we meet our social needs, because if they are not being met in moments when we are in a space where the erotic is present in a expanded state of consciousness, then we might end up starting to use our client very often unintentionally to meet our social needs. But that would not be right given the role that we have. As I mentioned also before, now it's important to maintain boundaries that are set and also to have clear why they are there. It's not just telling clients we won't do this. It's really helpful to explain why. So it becomes a decision made in a relationship, not a decision taken by an authority figure. And the other thing is training, and training not only in therapy, not only in psychedelic accompaniment, but also to get some training in how to experience and work with sexuality in the first place, something that unfortunately is very absent in psychotherapy trainings. Let's take a moment to look at touch, because touch is something that is very often present in psychedelic spaces, or definitely can be. It is true to say that touch can be an entree to sex, and it is also true that it can cause re-traumatization in certain situations. One also needs to bear in mind that when one is dealing with someone who is under the influence of a substance, one is dealing with someone whose judgment is compromised. They are someone with impaired autonomy. At the same time, it's also important to bear in mind that withholding touch can be very counter-therapeutic in its own way, because one would be teaching something to the other person through absence, through neglect. In a way, this is very similar to when a child learns about their own self-image, or the difficulty of actually doing so as a result of neglect during childhood. So what are some tips around how to navigate the area of touch when accompanying someone in a psychedelic session? The first is to actually check before the session starts what the person is comfortable with in relation to touch. Have that clear conversation. But regardless of what is discussed there, it is also important to check during the session, anytime that you are going to engage in touch, whether the person is okay. They're very simple. Is it okay if I hold your hand, for example? Because one needs to bear in mind that the person is, at that moment, has a level of impaired autonomy when it comes to consent and decision making. It is also important to look out for these very subtle non-verbal cues that say that the person is no longer okay with touch. Bearing in mind that, again, even the linguistic part of the brain might be a bit compromised when under the influence of a psychedelic. Another important point is never reverse any decisions that were made prior to taking the substance during the psychedelic session, because the person might say that they want something else, but again, bearing in mind that the judgment faculty is compromised in that moment. Being careful around touch does not mean acting out of fear or hesitation or withholding, because this can actually generate and reinforce shame while the person is in a state of neuroplasticity, which is definitely not what we would like to happen. Ultimately, any touch that happens needs to signal that I am present, and I am present for you. So how do we go about embracing the erotic, therefore? And for this I will go back to the Hippocratic Oath again, where we look at the fact that doing no harm is not only about increasing safety, but it is also about increasing benefit. In fact, the oath says, "I will devise and order for them the best diet according to my judgment and means." And maybe sometimes that diet entails psychedelics, sometimes it entails touch, sometimes it entails having that conversation around the erotic in a very explicit way, in a very clear way. As relational beings, healing happens in relationship. And this is what allows us to create new relational patterns. So we need to engage with the erotic material as the client's expression of their ability to love, to take care of, to desire. Even our own erotic material for that matter. And when we look at this erotic material, it's important to remember that this ability to love, this expression of the ability to love, is always embodied. And because we are bodies, it is always present. And allowing it to be there, embracing it, is what allows for this dimension to be integrated in oneself. A dimension that very often carries very different emotions and experiences, from shame to guilt to anger to hurt to abuse. And therefore it allows the person to feel loved as who they are in a non-shaming way. In order to embrace the erotic, we need to open a space to talk about it, to shed light on it, and therefore get it out of the shadow. So we do this by discussing with the client before they take the psychedelic substance themselves, telling them about the possibility that erotic feelings can come up, and in a way normalizing that. It's also helpful to talk about it with the clients after they've had the experience, perhaps not immediately after, although if that comes up, it could also be a good space to do so, but definitely afterwards in the integration phase to explicitly check about, were there any feelings that came up for you in relation to me? No? In a way, giving permission for those things to be brought up, to be brought to the surface. And definitely it is important to discuss it with peers or supervisors so that it doesn't remain in this hidden space where it can fester. No? The erotic is an energy that is bodily. It is very powerful. And we can either block it or we can dance with it. When we accompany people, we need to learn how to dance. And in doing so, the likelihood is that we will step on some toes in the process. But the more we learn how to dance, the more aware we become of dance movements, the more we involve others to teach us how to dance, the less mistakes we will make, and the more beautiful the dance becomes for all of those involved. So as we come towards the end of this presentation, I would like us to go back again to the story of Eros and Psyche. Eros falls in love with Psyche. But it is a relationship that is lived out in hiding, and therefore it's hard to define its outlines. And yet, Psyche desires to know Eros, to see him. But the actual knowledge of him results in a betrayal. And this will lead the Psyche to go through this whole yearning process, all of these trials, in order to get to Eros. But it is this process, this journey that the Psyche, that the soul makes, that leads her to become ultimately one of the gods. So it is Eros who transforms the soul, Eros who transforms the Psyche. And we, as the people who accompany others, hold the sweet burden of holding space for this transformation to take place, and also to take an active part in it. If you have any queries or any comments that you would like to share, or you would like to reach out to me, feel free to contact me using the contact details, the email that is shown over here. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that this has been a good source of reflection for you.